Hi, I'm Dave Cross. Welcome to this class on Photoshop for beginners. Now, one of the things I want to talk about right off the top is what we will and won't be talking about in this class. One of the things that concerns me when I talk to people who are very new to Photoshop is they're overwhelmed because there's so many tools and options in Photoshop. So let's talk about that right off the top. We're not going to cover every single tool in Photoshop because, frankly, you don't need to. There's actually 68 tools, 29 panels, and 10 menus with more than 600 options in them. Now, unless you're planning to teach Photoshop for a living, frankly, there's no reason to learn all of those things. So I'm not going to cover all of them because, as I said, you don't need to know them. So I want to get that set right from the start, as this is not going to be a class where we're going to go through every single tool one at a time because, honestly, you don't need it. Here's all the tools in Photoshop. In fact, this is not the very latest version. This is a graphic I did recently, but there's since been 2 more tools added. And you can see when they're exploded out, look at all those tools in there. That's an awful lot. But realistically, on a day-to-day basis, I use maybe half, sometimes less. And that's one of the key things I want you to understand right from the get-go is you shouldn't feel that you need to learn every single tool and function, at least right away, because from a day-to-day standpoint, you won't need them. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I'm going to suggest that you want to plant in your head right from the beginning is there's a lot of things happening in Photoshop. There's a lot of places where you can be either in the tools or in a panel or on the screen. So one of the things that I suggest that we start thinking about is going through a checklist. That means before you go too far trying to do something, you kind of go through a quick little checklist of the tool, the settings, the layers, and so on. So let's take a look at an example of what I mean. So here I have a document open in Photoshop, and this is a fairly typical layout that you'll see with tools down one side, panels on the other, and of course the menus across the top. But this part right here, this bar called the options bar, is one of the most important things you need to start getting used to using. And we'll get into this in more detail as we look at certain tools. But as an example, if I click on a tool like my brush tool, the first thing on my checklist should be what are the settings for the tool. And these settings are determined by the options bar. So in a sense, you could look at the options bar as almost the default settings for the tool until you change it back to something different. What that means is every single time you make a change in the options bar, it'll stay that way from then on until you change it again, which can be both good and bad. The good part is if you're doing similar work, you don't have to worry about the tool settings, but if you haven't used a tool in a couple of weeks, it may be that 2 weeks ago you did use some setting that was kind of unusual. So this way, it's a good habit, a good part of your checklist is to click on a tool and immediately go to that options bar. It's also important to note that the options bar works before you use the tool. Very few exceptions. So in other words, you can't use the tool and then, oh wait, I should have changed this option. It's too late at that point. So you need to, that's part of why I call it a checklist, is click on the tool, check the options bar, and then start using the tool. Now, of course, like any program, Photoshop has the ability for you to undo and step backwards so that it's not a horrible thing if you check the wrong tool settings and have to undo. But one of my favorite expressions, I'd rather spend more time doing and less time undoing. So I'm going to set up my tools as best I can and go through this checklist to make sure I'm doing things in a way that gives me both the results that I want, but also an opportunity to change my mind. So back to our look here. And again, we'll talk about this in more detail in a moment. I just wanted to get us started here. Part of my checklist also will become the layers panel. We'll talk in great detail about layers and working with layers. But as an example, if I took my paintbrush and painted directly on the background layer, now that's a permanent part of my document. So instead, if I undo that and add a new layer, and again, we'll talk more about what layers do. Now when I paint, I have the ability to change my mind because that paint is on a layer all by itself. Now don't worry if right away you're going, wait a minute, what's happening with layers? We'll get into that shortly. I just wanted to sort of set the tone for you to say this is part of the process, is going through this checklist. One of the things I found as I've taught a lot of people over the years is Photoshop is a fun, exciting program to work with, but sometimes people jump in a little too fast, do some work, and then kind of go, hey, what happened here? So that's why I'm suggesting right from the get-go, we want to talk about this checklist concept to go through and do things a bit at a time and make sure you're setting yourself up for success. Next, let's talk about how we can set up Photoshop to look the way we want. And this is something you can change over time, but we're going to look at the overall setup of the way the Photoshop interface works. In this lesson, we're going to dig a little deeper into the look and feel of Photoshop, the setup, and how you can organize things the way that you want. Photoshop comes with this layout called a workspace, which is really the position of the elements in that interface, the tools, the panels, etc. This is something that you can work with the defaults that Adobe gives you to begin with, and then over time start to make it your own. So the way it looks, as I mentioned in the last lesson, is we have typically the tools on one side and these panels here. Now this is not the way Photoshop probably looks for you. This is my workspace that I've created. I'm going to use this pull down menu right here, and by the way I can also get to it through the window workspace menu, but this is, if you see this menu, this is just as easy. So when I choose Essentials, this group of workspaces right here are ones that Adobe have provided as examples. So here they have set up with color and swatches and libraries and a small little layers panel. And there's nothing wrong with that layout of elements whatsoever. However, one of the things I'm going to recommend throughout this course is we're going to spend most of our life in the layers panel. So I'd like to make that as big as I can because that's the one I'm going to spend most of my time in. So when you're looking at panels, see how they have the name here, like in this case color or swatches. I can switch between them simply by clicking. But let's say that I want to choose a color, so I click on the color that I want. And now that I've done that, really I don't need this panel open anymore, but I don't want to hide it completely. I just want to make it less obvious, take up less room. So if you double click on the name of a panel, it collapses it down. So here, for example, the Libraries panel is one that I use occasionally. This is in the last couple of versions of Photoshop. You may not see that panel depending on your version, but even if it was something else like Adjustments or Styles, this is still taking up a lot of room. So once again, I would double click to collapse that, and here's now I have a nice big Layers panel. So this method of collapsing and enlarging panels saves you space, but also allows you to put most of your focus on a particular panel, in this case the Layers panel. Over here to the side, you'll see there are smaller icons for other options. So if we go to our window menu, this is a list of all the panels that are available. And for example, one of the things that we might want to do is work with our brush panel. So if I go down and choose that, it's going to suddenly pop up here and add it. Now if it doesn't add it like that, if, for the sake of argument, you end up with something like this that just looks like a floating panel, generally I suggest you don't want to get in the habit of having your panels float like this, because when you do, you end up having to spend half your time moving them around so you can see what's happening underneath. So if you click right on the tab and drag it, you can see a little blue line appears to say that's where I'm putting it, is right there in this little mini panel. Because the reason I do that is the brushes panel, while I use it quite often, nowhere near as much as others. So I still want it to be more accessible than always going to the menu, but this mini panel means that it's there as an icon, and now anytime I want to use it, I just click once and it opens up everything. Then once I'm finished using this panel, I can collapse it down again. So over time, what I think you'll find is you start saying, oh, I also use paragraph styles or properties or whatever it might be. So this is one that I'd like to have available to me all the time, so I'm going to put it in this pop-up menu of options here. So if I switch back to my workspace, you'll see that I've spent some time doing that, so I have a number of things in my small panels, and these are ones again that I don't use as often, but I want them more accessible than always having to go to the window menu. In the first lesson I mentioned the fact that Photoshop has this memory where when you change things in the options bar, it's going to keep it that way until you change it again. This is a function that for whatever reason Adobe calls something being sticky, meaning it'll stick that way until you change it. So the same principle applies to tools. If we look at the tools panel, you'll see anytime that you see a little indicator beside a tool, and that's almost all of them, that there is another option. So if I click on it, it's going to pop up and say, here are the 2 tools that are available in this area. So for example, under the marquee tools, it says here are the 4 options. So let's say I chose to use the elliptical marquee tool, now that I've done that, every time from now on that I open Photoshop and use it, it'll be showing me the elliptical marquee tool because that's the way I left it. Now I mention this just because sometimes people go, wait a minute, where did the tool go? They're all still there, it's just displaying it based on the last one you used. So if we go through any particular one, you can see quick selection tool. Now some of these you may find, for example, I like the quick selection tool better than the magic wand, so I'm perfectly fine with having it as sort of my default tool here. But part of the reason I mention this again is because I've seen people get into some trouble where they're trying to use a tool and wondering why is it not working for them. So however you leave it, that's how Photoshop will remember things. The other part of this overall interface kind of idea, if we go under the Photoshop menu to Preferences, you'll see there is a preference called Interface. And what this lets me do is actually change the color scheme. Yours may look like this, very dark. I'm going to just move this to the side so you can see, or lighter, lighter, lighter. And this is a preference. That's why it's called that, Preferences, because you can change it to the way that you want. If you find that the fonts underneath the menus are a little small, you can change it to bigger sizes. I'm not going to do that in this case, but you can do that so that if you're finding it because of your monitor resolution that's hard to see the menus, then you can change that as well. Now again, these are called preferences because it's up to you, but I wanted to point that out because some people say, well, mine looks different than someone else's. This is one of the reasons is you can adjust that preference accordingly. Once you click OK to a new setting, again, it's sticky, so it'll stick that way until you put it back again. Next, let's talk about ways we can get our files into Photoshop to start working on them. In order to be able to work on something in Photoshop, of course, we have to get it into the program. So now we're going to explore some of the ways you can do that. Depending on your operating system, it may well be set up so that if you double click on a file like a JPEG or a TIFF or something, it may just open right in Photoshop automatically. If it doesn't, then you need to change the setting, which we'll talk about throughout this. But the simplest way is just to open a file and start working on it. So I'm going to close this one, and don't worry about saving any changes, and I'm just going to go to File and then Open. I'm on the Macintosh, so this is my interface, and it allows me to dig through and find where I have the files that I want. So you have files somewhere on your hard drive, you have to navigate to that using whatever your operating system does, and then choose the file you want, and then open it. That brings the file into Photoshop, and of course we can then start working on it. So that's one of the simplest options. If you're finding, like some people do, that when you go to the File menu and you see a series of files that have file names, especially if you've shot in RAW and they just have names, it's a little hard to tell which image is which. So another option is to use a command called Browse in Bridge. Bridge is a separate program from Adobe that comes with Photoshop, and it acts as kind of like a visual browser. So instead of looking at just file names, you're looking at thumbnails of your images. As we'll see in a separate lesson, you can also do some other things with those thumbnails in Photoshop, but as a way of picking the right file to get into Photoshop, it really works really nicely. So here, I can see I have a bunch of images in here. If I want to see them bigger, I can enlarge them a little bit, and I decide this is the one that I want to work with because it's a nice photograph. So I just say that's the one I want, I double click, and it opens in Photoshop. If I want to get back to Bridge, I can once again choose Browse in Bridge or use something on your operating system. I use a Macintosh, so I press Command Tab, allows me to switch back and forth between the two programs. Now, one of the things you may need to do in Bridge to make sure that when you double click on a file that opens in Photoshop is go to the Bridge Preferences. And by the way, you'll notice it has similar preferences to Photoshop where you can set the interface color, but we want to talk about this one right here, File Type Associations. And this has every file format you can possibly imagine, including many you may never have even run into before. And what you want to do is go through and say, okay, if I get a DNG file, I want it to open in Photoshop. If I get a JPEG file, I want to make sure it opens in Photoshop. Now, depending on your system, it may say something else here. So this is something you have to do once, if necessary. to make sure that your files are actually opening from Bridge into Photoshop. Now, let's briefly talk about one other aspect where Bridge can be a real help, and that is if you shoot in RAW format, that means that RAW files need to go through a RAW processor, often either Lightroom or Camera Raw. Now, in this course, we're really not going to talk about the Lightroom aspect, but let's at least talk about, since we're in Bridge. If I see a RAW file here in Bridge and double click on it, it actually launches a separate little program called Adobe Camera Raw, or ACR. So here is a RAW file. If I double click on it, it looks like I'm going into Photoshop because you saw Photoshop for a second there, but it brings this separate application which allows me to go through and make adjustments to my photograph. Then I'm going to hit open, and now it'll open in Photoshop. Now, as I mentioned before, you can also usually just double click on a file. If it's in your Finder on the Macintosh or your desktop on the PC and you just see that's the file I want, you can either double click on it to have it open in Photoshop. If that doesn't work, if for some reason it's opening in some other application, you can kind of force the issue by taking the icon of the file and dragging it on to the icon of Photoshop. And you can do that if you see the icon either on your desktop or in the Mac on the dock. It's not a method that I really tend to use very much because I've set my computer up to say I want to open every file that I can in Photoshop. So for me, I can just double click on a file and it goes into Photoshop. Now, since I have this here, and this is not really part of the lesson on opening things, but I just want to mention this, since I have 3 documents open, this is the default setting for a view that's called Tab Document View. If we look under the File menu, you'll see there is also a couple of other options. Open as Smart Object, or also Open Recent. So this is a nice function if you have worked with images previously and you want to open it again, it'll remember the list of the last few things you've opened. We're going to talk about Smart Objects briefly in another lesson, but for now, these are the main methods that we would use. File open, using Bridge, Open Recent, or double clicking on a file in your computer desktop to get them into Photoshop. Next, let's talk about when you start working with multiple images and changing the view of them so you can start working on them. In the previous lesson, I talked about how to open files, and the end result, I ended up with 3 images open at the same time. So now let's talk about how to deal with that. How do you work with multiple images open? How do you switch between them? And how do you work with the views of those images? So here's where I left off with 3 documents open, and we're going to use this bar up at the top here, just below the options bar, to navigate between them and realize which one we're actually working on. So the document I'm working on is the one that has the lighter color of these 3. If I want to look at the other documents, I simply click once on either one of those tabs, and it says, here are the documents you currently have open. That's called Tab Document View, which I really recommend. I'm going to show you another option reluctantly. I would recommend you not get in the habit of doing this, and that is you do have the option of saying float all in Windows. And this is sort of an old school way of working where you have all these documents piled on top of each other. But the problem is, anytime I want to work with them, you end up spending half your time moving them around, especially when you get to this point where now I can't see the other ones. I have to go to the window menu and try and find it. So I wouldn't really recommend that. Some people do that because they feel like they want to work with 2 windows at the same time. Well, here's a solution for that. So first of all, I'm going to go back to the window menu and choose Consolidate All to Tabs. And this is going to be the view that I suggest that we work on as much as possible. So let's say, for the sake of argument, I'm just going to close this file for now, that these are the 2 documents I want to work on. And I want to see them side by side so I can either drag things between them or copy and paste or do something that we'll talk about later on to work with them both at the same time. Rather than floating them in Windows, the other option is to tile them. And you can see there's various options for 2 up, vertical or horizontal. And you can see now I'm seeing a portion of each image. I still have to click on either one to say this is the one I want to work on, but it saves me having to look at only one at a time. So this is an option that some people use, again, when they're trying to do something between 2 images. That's fine. I would suggest, though, for the most part, try to avoid floating them in Windows and instead use this tab view. So I'm going to put them back to Consolidate All to Tabs. Now I want to point something else out to you right here. Take a look at the information in this tab here. It's saying the name of the file, and it's saying at 42.6%. This one says the name of the file at 16.7%. What does that mean? Well, when we're working on a document, the bigger the file, or the higher the resolution, the bigger it will appear ultimately on the screen. So because when you first open a document, it's showing you the whole document, it's going to scale it down to fit the size of the view on your window. Now, one of the potential areas of confusion here is when people start to zoom in, it looks like if you print the document, it's going to be enormous, but that's just the on-screen resolution. So we're still going to ultimately look at the size of the file, the dimensions of it, and make sure it's the way that we want to print it or to output it. But this viewing option means the higher the quality, the bigger the file size, or the higher the resolution of the file means we can zoom in further, see the image bigger on our screen to do more detailed work. So for example, if I go to the View menu, you'll see there's options here that say Zoom In, Zoom Out, Fit on Screen. Fit on Screen says I'll scale it up to the size that's available to me based on your other panels. So it still shows me the whole thing. This is a very important view we're going to spend a lot of time working on, because every so often you're going to zoom in, but then you also want to zoom out to this Fit in Window view to sort of see an overall, how does what I'm doing relate to the overall image. We're not going to talk a whole lot about keyboard shortcuts, but I'll say this is one that most people learn fairly quickly. Command or Control 0 for Fit on Screen. If I continue to zoom in or hit Command or Control plus, I just did one more from the menu. Now I'll use the keyboard, and you'll see each time I'm zooming closer and closer to the point where finally it says 100%. Well, if you look at this, that's an extreme close-up of the side of the boat. But again, not to worry, this is a good thing because it means I've got good quality for printing bigger, but ultimately when I want to find out how big really is this, if I go to the Image menu and Image Size, this tells me in pixels it's 342 by whatever, but if I choose temporarily change to inches, this means I could print it as big as a 9 by 14. In fact, I could probably print it even a little larger than that. So don't get thrown off by the zoom in factor. This just means that now, if I take my hand tool, the hand tool is the tool we use to scroll our view around, which is much faster than using the scroll bars. Now I can hold and drag to a particular part of my image to say, this is the part that I want to work on right here, do some work, and then press Command or Control 0 to go back to the Fit on Screen mode. Now let's switch to this other document. This one isn't quite as high a quality image. Let's see how big this one is. This is a little smaller. Let's go to the image size command for this one and find out what it is. And you can see it's a little bit smaller. It's only 4 by 6 inches. That also means that when I start to zoom in, I can only zoom in a couple of times and all of a sudden I'm not going as far. Now watch what happens if I continue to zoom in. Nothing to stop me from zooming in, but you can see it starts to get pixelized very quickly. And one good habit to develop early on in the game is resist the temptation to zoom in really, really close when you start to see big fat pixels like this because, well, for two reasons. First of all, it's hard to do really fine detail work. But secondly, if you're zooming in that far on something, the odds are you're changing detail that the human eye won't be able to see. Remember your final result. If I'm going to put this image on my Facebook page or print it off, it's going to be, this big. Not gigantic, so there's really no point in me zooming in really close to do tiny little detail work, especially if when you see the final result, no one would actually ever see it. That's one of the reasons I suggest keep in mind, Command and Control 0 for Fit on Screen, to remind yourself this is the overall look, and then if we go to the View menu and choose 100% size, which has the nice keyboard shortcut, Command or Control 1, that means this is 100% view. If I go anything more than this, most of the time, it's going to just end up causing me trouble. Now, there is also a zoom tool here at the bottom. This has an option for me to zoom into a particular area. Now, if we look in the options bar for this tool, you'll see there's actually buttons, 100%, fit screen, fill screen. So if you're the kind of person where you can't remember keyboard shortcuts, you can use the buttons to go between those same views there. Scrubby zoom is turned on by default, and that means if I want to zoom into a particular area like this boat, if I click and hold and drag to the right a little bit, you'll see that it zooms into that area. I can also do single clicks once I'm in that area. If you want to zoom back out again, we have to somehow tell it to zoom out. You could either change the tool setting up here, and now it becomes the zoom out tool, or hold down the Option or Alt key, and each time you do single clicks, it will zoom back out again. Or again, of course, we can click one of these buttons here to do it that way. That brings up a good point here, and that is one of the things you'll discover is the reality of Photoshop is in most situations, there's almost always at least 2 or 3, if not 5 different ways to do the same thing. And that's part of what also can make Photoshop a little overwhelming for people is it appears as though there's so many choices. But that's really just because Adobe likes to give people choices. So there's no right or wrong answer to say, oh no, you should do it this way. As long as you end up with the view you want, it doesn't really matter if you use the zoom tool or the view menu or the keyboard shortcut or the buttons with the zoom tool. It's all the same end result. So don't stress out and worry about, am I doing it the correct way? As long as you keep in mind things like how far to zoom in and not to over zoom and things like that, everything will be just fine and you'll be zooming in and out and scrolling around your document in no time at all. One last thing I want to show you, and that is if you like to use keyboard shortcuts, here's a nice one here. I'm going to switch to my Move tool and let's zoom in a couple of times, Command or Control plus. Well, now that I've zoomed in, I can't see the image at the bottom. I could go and click on my hand tool, but if you press and hold on the space bar, it temporarily gives you the hand tool. And you have to keep holding that space bar down. Now, once I'm in the right place, as soon as I let go, it goes back to whatever tool that I was using. So for example, if I was using a tool like my paintbrush, and I need to paint in some area, I hold down the space bar, click and drag to that area, start painting, click and drag, and paint to that area. The nice thing about this kind of shortcut, if you aren't 100% sure, just try it. Hold down a certain key and you'll see each time you do, you're getting a slightly different icon. When you see the hand tool, you know this is the right one. Next, we're going to talk about some ways where you can set yourself up for success by taking advantage of things like layers and something called working non-destructively to make sure you can experiment and undo and change your mind as much as you want. You may have heard people use the term non-destructive or working non-destructively in Photoshop, and really what that means is using techniques that allow you to change your mind. However, to me, working non-destructively offers many more options and advantages, not just the ability to change your mind. So I think some people think of it as, well, if I make a mistake, I can correct it. Well, that's part of it. But also for me, it allows me to have more creative freedom. I can go down a road and experiment a lot, knowing that I'm not stuck in this very linear path that I normally am in Photoshop. By default, Photoshop is a very linear program, meaning you do steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and if you change your mind, you can undo 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. By introducing these non-destructive methods, we can take advantage of the ability to change our mind in other ways, not just in a linear fashion. So here's what I mean. If I take my paintbrush, and I'm just going to paint 1, 2, 3. Now I've done a really bad thing here for the purpose of demonstration. I painted directly on the background layer, but I did that in part deliberately to show you what's happening. Photoshop has a panel called the History panel, which will show what I've done so far. I've gone to Open, Image Size, and done 3 brush strokes. So if I decide I want to step backwards, I can go back 1 step, or back 2 steps, or back 3 steps. The problem is, what if I want to keep 3, but not the other 2? Well, if I click on this one, because of its linear nature, it's going to do all 3. Now, if we look under the Edit menu, you'll see it has Undo and Redo. So let's start over. I'm going to go back here for a second and paint again just to show you another variation here. So if I do my 3 big brush strokes, if I go to the Edit menu, you'll see it says Undo Brush Stroke. If I choose that, it'll undo the last one. And by the way, that was the Command or Control Z option. But now it changes to Redo. So really, Photoshop technically only has 1 undo. You can undo and redo the last step. But if I go down here to step backwards, this is the same equivalent as that History panel where I can go backward, backward, and then forward. But you'll see it's doing it in that very linear 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1 kind of approach. So I'm going to revert this image. Revert is a command that says, you know what, I've been playing around, I just want to start again with my saved images. So imagine this says revert to the last time I saved, because that's really what it should say. So one of the first things we learn about working non-destructively is layers. Are layers? Well, you know what I mean. So if I click on this button right here, and by the way, you'll get to learn very quickly that this button, which looks like a turning page, is Adobe icon for new. So when I add a new layer on top, that's almost like I'm putting a sheet of clear protective plastic on it. So even though I'm going to paint and it'll look like I'm painting directly on the background, I'm painting on this separate layer, which offers me instantly some variation, and it takes away that linear way of working. So I'm still going to first of all paint 1, 2, 3, but the difference is now it's on a separate layer. Now whenever you hide a layer, this is what this little eyeball is for, hiding the background layer, you'll see that the top layer has this checkerboard look, and in Photoshop, checkerboard equals transparency. So they do that just so you can make sure you understand that the only thing on this layer is the paint. Now, I'm still working on this layer, and if I went to undo the brush, I'm still in the same boat. But the difference is, because it's on a separate layer, I could, for example, take the eraser tool, not a tool that I would necessarily recommend using. We'll talk about some other options later on, but now you can see I can erase the number 2 out of the equation and just have 1 and 3. Now I couldn't have done that before if I had put it on the background layer and I only have that linear step backwards. But by putting things on separate layers, now it gives me more options. So let's take this a step further. I'm going to actually add 1, 2, 3 layers. And on the first layer, take my paintbrush, paint the number 1, click on this layer, 2, click on this layer, 3. So now you can see I actually have 3 separate layers on top of the background, each with a number on it. So now I have all kinds of options, not the least of which is hiding, but also if we decide that we don't like the order, we can put 3 over here, click on the number 1 layer and put number 1 over there. Now again, don't worry, we're going to go more into layers shortly, but this is just to kind of show you the advantage of why working non-destructively gives us a huge advantage. Now, before I go any further, I want to make sure that one very important thing is stated, and that is to take full advantage of this. When I save this document, I'm going to save it in PSD format, which stands for Photoshop Document. That means it's going to preserve exactly what you see in your layers panel so that anytime you open it, you'll have access to these layers. And I'm going to recommend that you always, and I mean always, do that. Always save a layered version of your document. That's going to become like our master file, the one we can go back to at any time. And then if you need to make something for Facebook or send to a lab or send to a friend, then you save a copy that doesn't have layers. And that copy probably be something like JPEG or TIFF. So PSD format to me is my master file, my working document that allows me to take advantage of these types of situations. Now, let me show you one other example of working non-destructively, and again, we're going to go into this in more detail, but I'm just setting the tone here. If we look under the image menu, there's all these different adjustments where we can adjust the way a photograph looks. So for example, if we use something like hue saturation, I can say I'm going to change the hue of this document to a different color and make it oversaturated and darkened up. None of which I would actually probably do. But just to make a point, and I click OK, take a look over my layers panel, now that's my background layer. So if I save that, then from now on, that's the way my photograph looks. So there are plenty of ways you can adjust a photograph. This, however, is not a way that I would recommend. Instead, I'm going to undo that, and down at the bottom of the layers panel, or if you see this icon called adjustments, if you don't see it, you can go to the window menu and choose adjustments. There are these things called adjustment layers, and this is a special kind of layer. Let's use this one so you can see it. Here's hue saturation. Now, a couple of things happen. First of all, the adjustment is now made over here in a panel, not on top of my photograph, so my whole photograph is clear and easy to see. So let's make, again, a very odd adjustment, just to make a point. Take a close look in this Properties panel where the hue saturation adjustment layer, there's no OK button. And that's one of the huge differences here. I don't actually click OK to apply this. All I do is just kind of leave it that way. So now I have this special layer in here, and if we could see it, it would say hue saturation. And like other layers, I can now turn it on or off.
I can also make an adjustment like this, and then if I save it as my PSD file and come back 2 weeks later and look at it and go, interesting choice. This icon right here, if I double click on it, it goes right back to the settings. See how it's where I left it? So now I can say, well, maybe I didn't really want to change the hue that much. I just wanted to adjust the saturation and maybe the lightness. So a huge advantage of adjustment layers is it's not permanent. It's another factor in this non-linear way of working where you can try something and see how it's going to work. So for example, maybe we're trying to replace the sky in this document. Well, it might be hard for me to see what I'm doing, so I might temporarily add an adjustment layer to make it easier to see what I'm doing. Once I have the effect I want, I throw the adjustment layer away because it was just a temporary measure. So undoing is very important, but remember there's technically only one undo and then we have step backwards. I prefer, as much as I can, to rely on using the layers panel and the setup of my document. So in a sense, I have unlimited undo because I can keep experimenting. Now, at a certain point, obviously, there's going to be a balancing act between do I want to have 45 layers versus 2 or 3. So you don't want to go overboard and have many, many, many layers, although, you know what, some people do because they feel like it's giving them the most amount of control. When we talk about layers, we'll talk about that in more detail. But right from the get-go, I want to suggest to you, this is the approach you want to take. Very rarely, if ever, do you want to work directly on the background layer. What you want to do is work above that using other layers and putting things on separate layers so that you have more options to experiment and to edit and to change your mind. One thing I also want to point out to you here, and you already saw me do it, but I'm going to show you again, don't be fooled by this lock symbol. This padlock tells me that the document is locked, but it's not really locked. All that's really locked is if I try to move it, it's going to say you can't move it because it's locked. But as you saw earlier, if I take my paintbrush, there's certainly nothing to stop me from painting directly on the background. So don't get fooled into thinking that this original background layer is protected, because it's not. One of the ways that we have to protect it ourselves is by being proactive about saying, let me add a blank layer on top and start working on that layer. Now, since I've introduced the topic of working non-destructive and working with layers, next let's really dig more into layers and how we work with them. This is my favorite part of the course where we really start to dig into the world of layers, because if you focus on doing everything you can using layers, trust me, your life will be simpler. I spent a lot of time teaching Photoshop, and over the years I see many, many problems people run into, and almost all of them could be solved with, oh, you didn't use layers when you created this document. So examples include doing things like painting or cloning or fixing directly on the background layer, or adding layers but then deciding to merge them together at some point and eliminating the advantage of having layers to begin with. So let's really dig in here and talk about the concept more of layers and how we take advantage of them. And it all revolves around the layers panel. That's why right at the beginning talked about setting up your workspace, having lots of room in your layers panel. I also like to have my icons nice and big, my thumbnail, so I can see what's on the layer. Now, I'm going to make a suggestion here, which I probably won't do during the tutorial because I'm more experienced with layers, but when you're first starting out, it's not a bad idea to get in the habit of naming your layers, so that way when you open a layer document later on, that PSD file, you'll be able to understand what's happening. Because if you see a bunch of layers called layer 1, layer 2, layer 7, layer 3, copy 2, it's kind of like, what is this? So name your layers. I'll show you how to do it in this first example, but I won't necessarily be doing it all the time. Just want to make sure that you get in the habit of doing that. So here's another document open. Remember, I've got that background layer. So the first question that often comes up is, when do I need to add a new layer? Well, anytime you're adding information, with one exception, which is type, which we'll talk about in a moment. So I'm going to add a new layer. On this new layer, let's take our elliptical marquee tool and just make a selection. And I'm going to go to the edit menu and choose fill. Put this back to normal and just say fill using foreground color, which is black. So now I have a big black oval. The move tool is our main tool we're going to use with the layers panel, because that's the one that allows me to move things around. Now, as you might expect, because I'm moving this layer around, I happen to put my mouse right on top of it. But as we'll see in a moment, that's not as important as do I have the correct layer active in my layers panel. So just to illustrate this, let's make a second layer. Now we'll make just a rectangle. I'm going to choose fill. In this case, I'm going to pick some color. That'll be fine, and click OK. So now I have two layers. I'm going to name these layers, double click, and call them box. And then double click on this name, call it oval. As I mentioned a moment ago, this is a good idea, a good habit to get into when you first get started. So look at what's on the screen on my image and look at the layers panel. You'll see it's displaying from the bottom up. My background layer at the bottom, then the oval, then the box. It happens that way because, well, those are the order in which that I created them. But we can change that, as we'll see in a moment. But let's go back to the move tool concept for a second. Here's what throws people off. If I intend to move this red rectangle, you can see my move tool is right here, but when I click on it, see how it's moving the oval? That's because I didn't check my layers panel to make sure I was on the right layer. Remember we talked at the very beginning about the checklist? Here's another perfect example. Before you go to move an object, check to make sure, am I on the correct layer? Because it's not how it looks on the image window that's important, it's am I on the correct layer in the layers panel. So in this case, I want to click once on the box layer to make sure that's the active layer. Then it doesn't matter where I click. Remember, that's like a sheet of transparency. If I hide the other layers, the only thing on that layer are those red pixels. So it doesn't matter where I click as long as that layer is active. Right now, the red box is on top and the oval is behind. But if I decide, for whatever reason, the order is incorrect, I just have to shuffle them up or down here by dragging. So I can either drag the box layer down like this, or I could have also taken the oval layer and dragged it to the top. Either way, I'm changing the order of how these display. Now, it's not at all unusual to experiment and say, well, now that I've created this beautiful work of art, let's just pretend, then I could say, but let's see what it looks like if I only had the red box. So I've hidden that layer, and it will stay hidden until I change it back again by clicking back on that eye icon. If I save this document as a PSD and close it, the next time I open it, it'll open just like this. All I'll see at first is that red rectangle, but I can look in the layers panel and go, oh, yep, there's that oval. I also have that option. So the most important thing right now that we need to think about is always be checking our layers panel to say, am I on the correct layer? Then when I click on that layer, I know I can do things like move and do other things to them. And that's just the beginning. Moving is just the first part. We also have some other interesting controls in the layers panel and things like opacity. So by nature, I added a new layer, and when I filled it 100% with red, I now have this red rectangle sitting above the background layer, 100% visible. But if we look at the top of the options bar, you'll see there's a command called opacity. If I just click right on that name opacity and drag it down, look what happens. The box becomes semi-see-through so we can see what's underneath. This is another function where it's not a permanent aspect. You can see that there's no OK button, so I just leave it at 70-ish%, save it that way, and when I come back later and decide, maybe I don't want 70%, I can just put it all the way back up to 100. Okay, just by moving it. Same thing with this layer. If I want this layer to be a different opacity, I just lower it down and I can leave it that way, knowing, once again, I can always put it back to 100%. So in those examples where I was just simply adding pixels, I had to actively add a new layer first to make sure that my result was going onto that separate layer. I want to do that as much as possible. So I'm going to just delete these two layers for a second and talk about a different type of layer, which is a type layer. Now, type is one of the few ones where you don't need to add a new layer first because it happens automatically. So if I click on the type tool, I look up in my options bar to pick the settings. For now, I'll just go with whatever that is. I click once on my image window and add some text. When you're using the type tool, it will stay active until you tell Photoshop you're finished. So you have to do something called committing the type. I'm going to click on this little check mark to say, yes, I'm committed there. We're good to go. Once I've committed the type, now it acts like a regular layer. So if I take the move tool, I can still move it around. If I take the opacity, I can still lower the opacity. Really the only difference is I didn't have to make a blank layer first. Now, I mention that because I know some people have the habit of always adding a blank layer no matter what type of content they're adding. Type is one of the few exceptions where you don't need to add a new layer first. So now I have some black text on here. What if I want a white box around that? Well, I'd add a new layer, take my rectangle tool, draw a rectangle, make sure it's in the right kind of position, and then choose Fill. From here I can choose white, click OK. Now the only problem is they're in the wrong order, so once again I can either drag the type layer up or the white box layer down. You see now I have these two separate layers. Personally, I would keep these two separate layers as much as possible. I want to have the ability to edit the type at any point. I'd also want the ability to have the box available to me in case I want to change the opacity, for example. So we put this down a little bit. However, now it means if I want to move, I have two separate layers. So if I hold down the Shift key, I can click on both layers. Now if I get my move tool, they'll move together as if they're one. But once I'm happy with them, I still have the opportunity to go back to this layer and change the opacity or whatever I want. Now this time I didn't name my layer, which again, as a habit, when you're first starting, I would suggest doing it. But after a while, in this case, I mean, I can look at the thumbnail of that layer and see it's a white box. But as a habit starting out, just to help yourself, it is actually a good idea to name your layer. So don't take me as an example in that case, but just get in the habit of doing that as much as you possibly can. So let's pretend for a moment this is a project that I want to keep working on later on. So I'm going to go to File and choose Save. I was able to choose Save in this case because it was a file that I opened as a JPEG, and because I've added layers, it assumes I need to save it as a Photoshop document. So I'm going to give it some name. Make sure layers is checked, which it will be if you choose Photoshop format. It says .psd in the end, and I hit Save. Now if I go to Browse and Bridge, there's the document I just created. So here's my original file, here's the one with the layer. So just by looking at it, I can see both with the visual thumbnail and with the file name .psd, I know this is my Photoshop document. So if I want to open it later on, I can just click on it. Now if I want to make further changes, maybe I want to adjust it somehow, I click on the background layer, add some kind of adjustment, like, well, let's do hue saturation again since we talked about that already, and change the hue just ever so slightly, something like that. Now, if we collapse our panels again, you can see I'm starting to build up a little bit of a structure here where I have the background layer that's untouched. I've used the hue saturation layer to make adjustments to that. Then I have my white box, then I have my type layer. Once again, saving that as that PSD file. I made a change to it. Now I just hit Save. And when I go back to Browse and Bridge, you'll see it's showing me that that change has been made. Now as we progress further, we're going to talk about some other functions, but you'll notice that the Layers panel becomes a recurring theme. So when we talk about removing blemishes or things you don't want, it's going to be based on layers. So everything we're going to do, with very, very few exceptions, will be based on layers. That's why this is such an important function in Photoshop. In a previous lesson, we talked about how to open documents in different ways. Now let's talk about another option, which is to start with a blank new document where you want to create something from scratch. And you might add other photos into it and things like that, but it starts with making a new document. Now, one of the things that we need to consider before we actually use the command to make that new document is, what are we doing with this document? What are we going to end up with? Are we preparing something that's just going to be put on a website, or are we preparing for something that's going to be printed? Are we printing it ourselves? Are we sending it out to print? All of these things will have a big influence on how you create the new document. And the reason I say that is because in Photoshop, you can always take something big and make it smaller without losing much quality, but you can't go the other way. So if there's even a remote possibility that you're going to create something from scratch that's going to be printed fairly large, I would start that size, and then, as I said, if necessary, you can always scale it down. So that's a really important factor to consider before you jump too far, because it'd be very easy to do all this work and then think, wow, this is so great, now I want to make it a print on my nice big sheet of paper and realize you don't have enough quality to do that. So the way we create a new document, of course, is under File, New, and then it's going to ask you how big do you want to make it. And this is where you have to make this decision. There are a number of things we can do in this dialog box. There are presets. So if you want to make a standard size, like a letter size piece of paper, there's a whole series of those. There's also different photo sizes, landscape and portrait in different sizes, like an 8x10. And there's also sizes for web and mobile devices and things of that nature. So if you knew, for example, that you were going to be putting it on a website of a certain size, I personally wouldn't do it that way, but that is an option. I almost always go to custom because I know I'm going to just make a decision myself. Remember when we talked about things being sticky in Photoshop? Here's an example. Previously I changed this to inches at some point, so it's still displaying that way, but I can change that easily if I know, for example, I'm doing something for a Facebook page where I've read what it says, and it says make it 1,000 pixels by 650 pixels, and I'm just arbitrarily picking a number. Now I did it in pixels, but I can see what would that be in inches, and it's showing me it's a 13 by 9 inch print, which might be the size that I want. So again, this is where we decide this. The resolution really is only important for print. If I'm making something that's a pixel-based image for an on-screen use, all I really care about is the width and height. The resolution will take care of itself. That resolution number really comes into play when you're doing something for print. If I'm doing something, for example, sending an image to my own printer, my Epson or my HP or whatever I have, I might set my resolution at 240 pixels per inch because I know that's a good quality for that type of inkjet printer. If I'm sending it out to a lab somewhere, I'm going to go and see what they say on their website. Some places will just simply do it in pixel resolution. Say, give us an image which is 4,000 by 3,000 pixels. And then they know that they can do the math and end up with the resolution they want. 300 pixels per inch is kind of a standard that a lot of people use, but it's not necessarily the best. It's just a good number that people remember very easily. But remember, the key is if we're doing something that's going to be done on an on-screen use, then the pixel dimensions is really the only important thing. So I'm going to click OK to this, and there's my new document. If you're ever unsure partway through and you want to remind yourself, the image size command under the image menu shows me it's 13 by 9 at a resolution of 72, just because that's what I last used. If you ever decide that I should have made this a little bigger, I need more canvas area, this is the canvas we're working on right here, then the other command is called canvas size. And this shows you the existing size and allows you to add on more pixel information. The relative checkbox is important because you can, if that's off, it shows you this is the exact size, so now I can make it 1200 by 850. And when I click OK, now my image is that much bigger. Let's undo that for a second. Go back to canvas size. If I had a number that was more unusual, like it was 1237 by 842, and I didn't want to do the math myself, relative means add on this much. So if I said like another 200 pixels to the width, another 200 pixels to the height, it basically just does the math for me. So in this case, the net result is the same, but that's a nice way if you're unsure. What if you just want it to be longer? Like I like this, the height of it, but I need to be a wider document. If I go back to that canvas size command, I can say all I want to do is change the width to make it 200 pixels wider. And right now, see this anchor area? It's going to put that 200 and evenly split it on both sides, which in this case, since it's a blank document, doesn't really matter. But in instances where you might have an actual photograph, you might want more canvas on one side or the other, by clicking on this little anchor button and saying only add new canvas to the right or only add it to the left. In this case, again, it doesn't matter. Down at the bottom, it's telling us what color do you want your canvas to be. And by default, it's our background color, which by default is white. So if I click OK to that, now I have a document that's been changed to that size. Now I realized I was doing that, I was saying add canvas to the right or to the left, but I was actually adding to the height. But I hope you get the idea of what was actually happening there, and it'll make more sense when we do this to a photograph where you can see the difference. In fact, let's do that now. I'm going to jump to Bridge and open a photograph. and I decide now I want more canvas all around the outside of this for me to do something to it. So I'm going to go to the canvas size command. I'm going to say that I would like there to be another 80 pixels to the width and the height. And when I click OK, you'll see now it's in effect added a white border around because I've extended the canvas that much. Let's undo that. Go back one more time to canvas size. And in this case, I'm going to say all I want is more height. So I'm going to add 80 pixels, but I want it not to be added to the top and the bottom. I only want to be added to the bottom. So I'm going to anchor up here. See how it's the arrow is pointing down to say only add the canvas here. So now when I click OK, you'll see you get the canvas just down at the bottom. So how you use that canvas size command will depend on the situation. If you're just trying to add more canvas all the way around, then that option of having the anchor in the middle and doing it relative makes sense. In some cases, when you're trying to get to a specific measurement, you can also type in the number. Now let's look at an example here. I have this new document that I created, and remember we have this tab document view to say here's my other document. I would like to add this document here to this blank document to start to create something. Well, there's plenty of ways of doing that in Photoshop, including things like copy and paste, but here's the thing. When you copy something in Photoshop, you're copying to the clipboard and it stays in that clipboard taking up valuable RAM. So one of the ways that we can get around that is through something called drag and drop, which means we're going to click on the image, drag it into the other one, and drop it there. Now the name is a little misleading because we don't actually drag and drop. In this case, we have to do something slightly different because we're in this tab document view. So I've got my move tool selected. I'm going to click and hold on this image and I'm going to drag it to the tab of the other document. I'm still holding my mouse button down. I'm waiting until the view of the image changes. Now I come back to the middle of this one and let go. And now you see it's been added and it automatically creates it as a new layer. So now I have, instead of just adding canvas around the outside of my photo, I've taken this photo, put it on a different image, so now that I can treat it as a separate layer. So let's do that one more time. Like I mentioned, people call it drag and drop, but really this is probably a better name for it. Click and hold, drag, wait, drag, release. So technically, I guess you could say you're still dragging and dropping, but the reason I mention it that way is a lot of people drag up to the tab and let go and wonder why did nothing happen. You have to drag to the tab, wait for the images to change, then drag it over. Now, earlier when we talked about the layout of Photoshop, this is one place where some people like to have, for example, that tile document view because it's a little more visually makes sense to them. So let's do that. I'm going to go to my window menu, choose Arrange, and just tell it to tile vertically. So now you can see I have this image on one side and my blank one on the other. Now I can really just drag and drop like that. And then I would change the view back to the tab view. So a couple of different ways of doing the same thing. As I mentioned before, and I'll probably mention again, there's always multiple ways to do things, and the choice you make will depend on the situation. So just to summarize this little section here, image size is going to say take the existing image and make it smaller or bigger. Canvas size says if you have a photograph, I'm not going to adjust the photo itself, I'm going to adjust the canvas around that photo. Normally, most of the time, you would use the canvas size command to increase the image, because if you decrease it, you would in effect be cropping it. So now let's talk a little bit about the aspect of cropping an image, because that's another important thing that ties into this whole area of working with the sizing of an image. So let's close this document and just work on this one here. So here's the image. If I change my view to fit on screen, you can see that's how big it is. It's telling me it's almost 100% view. And if I take my cropping tool, you'll see there right away there's little handles have appeared. And what this allows me to do is now if I want to crop the image, I start to drag in. Now this is a non-proportional crop, so it really is depending on me as to where I drag it. At a certain point, if you realize that you don't like what you're doing, hit the cancel button up here in the options bar or the escape key on your keyboard and it lets you start again. A typical scenario, I would think, would be I want to keep the proportions of this but just crop it a little tighter. So hold down the shift key and now as I crop you'll see it's keeping the same proportions of the image. Let's go just a little bit less. And now once I like it, I either hit the check mark, which is the commit button, or enter on your keyboard, and now the image is cropped to this size. Now it's important to note that cropping is by nature a destructive thing, meaning if I crop it and save it, those additional pixels are gone. So if you're uncertain about whether you want to crop it or not, this is a decision you'll have to make. You can also choose to crop it in a way that's less destructive. So I'm going to go back here and undo this. I'm going to switch away and go back to my crop tool. That's usually the easiest way to get the crop handles back. I'm going to, again, shift, drag like I did before, but I'm going to uncheck this option that says delete cropped pixels. So now when I hit return, it still looks the same way, and if I save it, it will still save it this way, but the difference is if I ever change my mind, I can go under the image menu and choose reveal all, and it will bring back the part that I've cropped. So again, this is one of those decisions you'll have to make on a case-by-case basis. If you know 100% sure you're trying to crop something out, then that's a fine thing to do. Just crop it and be done with it. But if you're uncertain, then I would do one of two things. I'd either uncheck that delete crop pixels, or make sure you have two different versions of the same document. In other words, duplicate the image, crop one and save it, and then save the original uncropped. So that gives you a few ideas. As I mentioned, one of the recurring themes you'll see in Photoshop is there's always multiple ways to do things. This just gives you a few ideas of some of the ways we can work with images.
I've mentioned it before in some of the other lessons, but now let's talk specifically about saving your document. I'm going to suggest to you that right away you get in the habit of always saving your file as a PSD file, that Photoshop document, and preserving all of your layers just in case, and then when you need to, make copies for other purposes. So for example, you're going to create something and then put it on your Facebook page. So we're going to save it as a PSD file. That's going to be my master file, my working file, whatever you want to call it. And then I'm going to save a copy without layers that's JPEG. So the chances are my master file might be a little bigger, because remember we talked about you can always scale things down. So my master file is going to be bigger with more layers, and then the copy I'm going to save might be smaller and saved as a JPEG. So here's an example of a document I've been working on. It's got a few layers, and we'll see later on how to do this kind of thing. And now it's still, this originally started as a camera raw file, so I've been working and I haven't saved it at all yet. So when I just go to File Save, because it has layers, it's going to suggest to me, well, I'm assuming you want to save it as a PSD file with layers, right? And I'm going to say, yes, in fact, I do. So I'm going to give it a name, keep it as a PSD file, and hit Save. Now, any change I make to this, so for example, if I add some more text, let's just add a regular type layer and do something with it. Let's make it a color and smaller. I'm going to put this down here, and let's lower the opacity and change the blend mode so it just kind of fades into the image, just so I have something done. Now, since I've made a change, I can just press Command or Control S to save that layer document. Now let's assume I'm ready to do something with this, so now I have to think about file format for saving. And the file format you'll use will depend entirely on what you're doing with it. So anything that's an on-screen based use is typically JPEG. You can also save as TIFF in some situations. If I am unsure and I'm creating something, for example, I use an online printing service to create things like postcards, I'm going to look at their suggestion. And if they say, we would like you to send us a JPEG in this size, then that's what I send them. If I want to send to a printing lab to get an actual nice print made on canvas or something, same thing. If they say we'd like this size of image saved as a TIFF file, you bet, that's what I'll do. So the one thing I'm going to suggest to you, though, is that there's a big difference between flattening and saving a flattened version. Two very different things. Here's what I mean. I have these layers made up, and I want to preserve them because I want to be able to edit my text and change it and play with it, etc. So if I said, well, let's see, I need to make a JPEG, and JPEGs can't have layers, and I'm showing you this to show you that please don't do this. but there is a command called flatten image. I can't get to it for you to see. Well, anyway, it's going to be hard with my filming area, but right at the very bottom it says flatten image. When you do that, there's no more layers. Now what some people do is they flatten image and then they save as a JPEG. And to me, that's tempting fate. That's taking a chance that's unnecessary. So I'm going to undo this and instead go directly to Save As, because that's going to tell me, well, I want to make a copy of it. It's still prompting me to save it as a layered Photoshop document because it sees layers. But look what happens. See, this checkbox says layers. Look what happens if I choose JPEG. It says, well, you can't have layers. So now when I hit save, it's going to ask me quality. I always keep my quality the highest. Now, let's go back to Bridge. Let's see, we have two versions of the same document, which visually look the same, but just at a quick glance I can tell this is my master file because it says .psd, and this is my flat version because it says .jpeg. And this is the version that I could then open and say, well, here's my JPEG file. Now let's look at the image size command, and if we say, well, we need it to only be 800 for our online purpose, then I'll click OK, and I'll save this. So now I'll have a flattened, smaller version that's JPEG while still preserving my master file. Now, as I mentioned, you can also do the same thing if someone wants you to save it as a TIFF file, but there is one slight difference. So let me show you that. I'm not going to bother saving that change. So here's back to my master PSD file. If I choose Save As and change the file format to TIFF, the difference is TIFF can have layers. And this could be a little confusing because the chances are if someone's asking you for a TIFF file, they don't want the layers. That's for you. So some people save their layer documents as TIFF files, but I find that just leads to some potential confusion because now a TIFF file could have layers and it could also not have layers. So personally, my recommendation to you, and it's worked very well for me over the years, is PSD file becomes my layered file. JPEG or TIFF becomes the flattened version that's based on the requirement of whoever I'm giving it to. If they say, can you please give me a TIFF file, then I'll come into this dialog. I say, sure, I'll give you a TIFF file, but I'll say, don't include the layers, and hit save. Down here, there's a few more options, but I'm just going to click OK. And once again, back in Bridge, now I have 3 versions. And this is, like I said, the danger of having a TIFF file is when you just look at it, you don't really know does it have layers or not. So in my world, the way I suggest you do it is the file name tells you everything. PSD, master file, TIFF and JPEG are the flattened versions that you would then send off somewhere else. Now there's another option which is okay. I don't use it that much anymore. It's for people who are creating something specifically to use on a website. There is an option called Save for Web, which is an older, it's saying legacy because that was, it's become less used perhaps now. But in this dialog box, one of the reasons people like it is because you can try different settings and see what happens if you change it from maximum quality to high quality, and it'll tell you the file size. Frankly, this is something I don't worry about as much. In the early days of the internet, it was important that we kept our file sizes as small as we could. We needed to optimize them because people were using dial-up modems and we had to worry about file size. Now, as you know, you can have big files, you can have videos, so this is less important, but it is another option for saving. Personally, I've just gotten the habit of saving that master file as a PSD file and then saving a flattened version in whatever format is required. And just please remember that big difference between flattening and saving, which means you've thrown away your layers, and saving a flattened copy, which means you're preserving your layers in that master PSD file. You'll get tired of hearing me say this throughout this course, but really this is going to set you up for success because the more you get in the habit of saving as a PSD file, the more you'll be able to reuse the same work, you'll be able to go back and look and remind yourself how you did it, and also not paint yourself into a corner where you realize the only version that you saved is a flattened one. Previously I talked about how to open files into Photoshop, but I want to spend just a little more time talking about when you're working with RAW files and either Camera Raw or Lightroom. Those areas are both topics unto themselves. We're not going to go into a huge amount of detail about how to process your files, but showing you how, when you start with either one of those programs, how then they can come into Photoshop so you can do further work on. So here in Bridge, I have a combination of files, PSD file, JPEG, and a RAW file coming, this one from Nikon. If I double click on it, and it opens in Camera Raw. Now in here I can make whatever adjustments I want, and one of the nice things about working in RAW in either Camera Raw or Lightroom is by nature it's non-destructive. Remember we talked before about working non-destructively and why it's important. The raw processing you do in either Lightroom or Camera Raw is by nature non-destructive, so you don't have to do anything special. So I'm going to make an adjustment. I'm going to overdo it to make a point, because by nature, when you're starting in Camera Raw, you can make all these nice adjustments, and let's again overdo it. But down at the bottom, you'll see the button says Open Image. So when I click on it, it opens it in Photoshop, but it's kind of like a one-way dead-end street. In other words, I don't have access directly to the settings that I changed. So if I look at it now in Photoshop and go, I don't really like that, I have to pretty much start over again. So in this case, if I realize I overexposed it and don't like this, I would just close it, don't save, and then go back to Bridge and start again. So there's one thing we can do in Camera Raw, and I highly recommend looking at this option, is down here at the bottom, down here at the bottom you see what looks like kind of an information. It just says RGB, 8-bit, etc. And if I click on it, it opens up this dialog box called Workflow Options, and at the bottom there's a checkbox that says Open in Photoshop as Smart Objects. Now, in another lesson, we'll talk more about what smart objects are and why they're important, but for now, we'll just go with that and click OK. Now, this dialog box says Open Object. So if I click on it, it still opens it in Photoshop, and I can still do things to it in Photoshop. However, if you look more closely at it, see this little symbol right here is telling me this is actually smart, which means, really, that it's created an editing street between Photoshop and Camera Raw. So if I double click on it, it goes right back to Camera Raw, and I can say, okay, that was kind of a bad choice. Let me put the exposure back down and maybe put the saturation not quite so much and click OK, and you see now it updates. So this has changed the rules a little bit. Instead of being a dead-end street from Camera Raw to Photoshop, now it's a two-way street, which allows me to do things like over-adjust a photograph to help me do something and then put it back later on, something of that nature. Now, as we'll see when we talk about smart objects, it does introduce one other little sort of trick to it that you have to work around, but I think the benefits outweigh any slight problem that it introduces, because having the ability to do an ongoing edit like this is really, really important. Now in Lightroom, it's similar but slightly different. So let's say this is the image that I want to work on. So I've chosen it, I do any type of adjustments, and then when I want to move to Photoshop, I have a couple of options. One of them says Edit in Photoshop. And when I do that, it applies whatever settings I've done, and it's going to open in Photoshop, but like in that first example with Camera Raw, as this one-way street, which is okay, but now I still don't have access to be able to edit it. So the other option from Lightroom is to go to the Photo menu, Edit in, but choose Open as Smart Object in Photoshop. That's going to do the same thing as we just saw. It's going to create this link with a slight twist. And here's the little twist. In the first example, when I started in Camera Raw, I double-clicked on that thumbnail to go back to Camera Raw. You would probably expect, since I brought it in from Lightroom, that if I double-clicked, it will go directly back to Lightroom, but unfortunately it does not do that, just because of the nature of how it works at this time. When I double-click on this, it actually goes to Camera Raw. Now the good news is, the engine, the thing that makes these programs work between Lightroom and Camera Raw, is exactly the same. So if I had made any changes to it in Lightroom, they would be reflected here in Camera Raw. So at least it still gives me the ability to work on it in the raw settings, but it just happens to be done in Camera Raw. So now if I made some change to it and clicked OK, it would go back to Photoshop. And the last part of this is, since I started in Lightroom, if I hit Save and go back to Lightroom, now we'll see there is a new document that's actually called, the name of a file, -edit.psd. So I have a PSD file that has that editing built into it. Now, if you don't use Lightroom or Camera Raw, obviously you could ignore this portion, but the whole point of this is just another way to allow us to take advantage of starting with a raw file and doing initial global processing and then bringing it into Photoshop to do final work. Why would I do that? Well, for example, retouching. Camera Raw and Lightroom have a pretty good tool for doing healing and things of that nature, but not quite as good as, say, for example, the patch tool in Photoshop. So if I ran into problems, I would take my file from Camera Raw or Lightroom, bring it into Photoshop, and then do that kind of retouching there. So it just gives you another option for a way to get our files into Photoshop. In a previous lesson, I introduced the concept of layers. Now let's dig a little deeper and talk about a couple of other layer functions, including one that's incredibly powerful and very, very useful called a layer mask. A layer mask also fits into our category of working non-destructively, because instead of getting rid of pixels completely, deleting them so they're gone forever, a layer mask allows us to experiment by hiding parts of a layer instead of deleting. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about what a layer mask actually looks like. So let's add a new layer. Just for the purpose of example, I'm going to make a rectangle and fill it with white. And now I want to make it look like this rectangle was behind her. Well, I can't just drag it down in the layer stack because this is the background layer. There's no transparency. So I need to make it look like it was never there. So one way to do it, I'm not recommending this, but I'm just saying this would be an option. Let's zoom in a little closer. Would be to take a tool like the eraser tool and start erasing it off of this layer. I'm going to do a pretty poor job for the purpose of demonstration. So now I've erased that. The problem is those pixels are actually gone. So if later on I decide that I really just need to move this over a little bit, the problem is it's no longer a rectangle because I deleted that portion. And it doesn't matter whether you take the eraser and do it, or if we step backwards, if I took one of my selection tools, which we'll talk about a little bit, and made a rough selection and said delete, it's going to be the same problem later on. If I try and move this, I've got a big hole in it. So if we step backwards, instead, another option is to add a layer mask. And the concept of layer mask works like this. Whenever you add a layer mask and the mask is filled with white, white is what many people consider reveal all, meaning don't hide anything, just keep it all visible. So right now, by default, when I added the layer mask, it's white, so therefore my whole layer is visible. Any areas that I want to hide completely, I need to add black paint. And I can do that in various ways. I can paint on the layer mask, I can make a selection and fill it with black. However you do it doesn't really matter. In this case, I'm going to take my brush tool and make sure I have a hard edge brush, and I'm going to make it a little bit smaller. That's pretty good. And now I'm going to paint with black. Now it looks like I'm doing the same kind of deleting. Let's do it really quickly here and not terribly accurately, but for the purpose of demonstration, we'll go with that. Now, if I take my move tool and move it, it still looks like a hole has been cut out of it, but look over here in the layer mask, you can see the whole rectangle is still there. This black mask is hiding it, so we can't currently see it. But it's a temporary mask, not a permanent thing, so I haven't actually deleted anything. So if I want to remind myself what it looked like, if I shift-click on the mask, it hides it completely, temporarily. Or if I drag it over and then realize I really shouldn't have had that on there, I can take my paintbrush, and when I change my color to white, I can put the pixels back in again. So one of the expressions a lot of people use when they're talking about layer mask is black conceals, white reveals, which is another way of saying when you paint with black, it hides areas. When you paint with white, it shows them again. So the big difference, and the important one that I want to make sure you understand, is erasing or deleting is very permanent. So if you go to grab the eraser and say, I'm just going to delete this off of this layer, think about that for a second, because what happens if 20 minutes from now you realize you wish you hadn't done that? It's kind of too late, because you'd have to step backwards all the way back and take away all that work you've done. So a layer mask is another way of working non-destructively that again takes away that linear aspect of working in Photoshop. So this way we can jump in anywhere we want and experiment. When you save a PSD file, a layer mask is yet another element that's saved as part of your layer, so you can both look at it later and see how you did it, but also experiment and change your mind. So let's look at another example here of using layer masks. So here's a document that I created previously, and all I did was I made a new document and I added 2 layers using that drag and drop kind of method, and now I want them to blend into each other. So let's take this layer. So let's take this layer here and move it over here, and take this other layer and move it over here. Notice how each time I'm clicking on the layer to make sure I'm working on the correct one. Now, I mentioned a moment ago this whole concept of black reveals, white conceals. Well, there's also gray. So I'm going to add a layer mask to each one of these. If I take my paintbrush, let's actually work on this top one to begin with. And in this case, let's go back and use a soft edge brush and make it fairly large. Just make it even bigger. There we go. A soft edge brush means it has gray on the outside. So if I come down here and make sure my foreground color is black and I start to paint, let's actually hide this for a second. See how there's some areas that are sort of see-through, sort of not? That's because if we look at the layer mask, it's got gray around the edges. So you see how it's not just pure black or pure white, there's gray in there as well. Now, by the way, to look at a layer mask, if you want to, you Option or Alt click on it. It's not really necessary, it's more just to show you what it's doing. So let's step backwards and get rid of that. Let's create our overlap again, and one of the ways we can blend images together is the gradient tool, which is found here under the paint bucket, or it might just be showing on yours. Go to our options bar, and one of the built-in options is a gradient that goes from black to white. So we think about this for a second. Black conceals, white reveals. So we want this edge of this top layer to be completely hidden and gradually fade in. So if I click over here and drag this way, it's going to create a gradual fade. Now if I click on the other layer mask and do the same thing on this layer, click and drag this way, now we've created another fade. And I can still move them around and adjust them to see how this is one of the ways you can start to blend images together, is remembering the way a layer mask works. Black hides completely, white shows completely, and gray is somewhere in between. So if you create either a very soft edge brush that has gray in it, or in this case, a gradient that goes from black to white, in the middle it's going to be different shades of gray. So the darker the gray, the more it'll be hidden. The lighter the gray, the more it'll be shown, till eventually it turns white, and then it will be shown completely. So this is a fairly typical situation where you're trying to do something, but if we look at the overall document, think about the fact that these 2 layers are still complete. I haven't deleted anything. They're still there. So if I later on I say, you know what, I don't really like this faded look, I take this layer mask and throw it away, and I take this layer mask and I throw it away, and I'm right back, I can just delete it, right back where I was at square one. Now, layer mask may seem like a complicated thing at first, but here's what I'd suggest you do to kind of get used to it, is take any document at all. Doesn't really matter. I'll just use this one since I have it. Make a new layer. Take one of your selection tools, make a big selection, and then under the Edit menu, choose Fill, but we're going to fill with a color. So let's pick a color like red. Click OK, and then we can go to the Select menu and deselect. Now, if you take the Eraser tool, you can erase parts of it completely, but if you look at the layer, it's completely gone and you can't get it back. So let's undo that and instead add a layer mask. Take your paintbrush, and you'll have to decide on the size of the brush. Mine's now a little bit too big. But I want to have a soft edge and make sure black is my foreground color, and just paint to hide a portion of this. Once you do that, after you've done that, look closely at the layers panel, and you'll see all the pixels are still there, but this big black blob you painted has hidden it. Now, if we were to save it and come back later, I could take my same paintbrush, switch my foreground color to white, and paint it to reveal all those areas again. So a layer mask is kind of the epitome of working non-destructively, because you can be very creative with it and try some really interesting things, but know that you're never 100% stuck with that. You don't have to ever feel like you're settling, because you can always try something and see what it looks like. So again, layer mask, for some people it's kind of an unusual concept, but stick with it because it's definitely one of the most powerful tools you'll have when you're working with layers in Photoshop. In an ideal world, every photo you take would be perfect. It would look just the way you want. There wouldn't be any distracting elements. There wouldn't be anything you want to get rid of. But the reality of life is that's not always the case. There might be something you didn't notice that you want to remove, or you might be working with a portrait of someone and they've got some blemishes you want to get rid of, or maybe you just take a photograph and then later on decide you want to look a little bit different. All of these things are forms of retouching, where you need to touch up the photograph to work with the elements that are there and maybe remove some of them or cover them up, shall we say. And that's actually a really good point, because a lot of people say, I just want to get rid of that. Well, you don't get rid of things in Photoshop as much as you cover them up to make them look like they weren't there. But even this can be done non-destructively. Now, by nature, it doesn't happen this way. So the temptation is to open a photograph, grab a tool like the clone stamp or the patch tool or the healing brush, and get rid of elements directly on that image, which is okay, but it doesn't allow you to change your mind on what if you don't do the greatest job, or what if later on you realize maybe you shouldn't get rid of that element at all. So I'm going to suggest to you that when you're doing retouching, that can also be done in a non-destructive way for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's easier to do because you can play around with things and not be worried about being very accurate, but also it allows you to lessen the effect of something. Sometimes we want to get rid of something completely. By using layers, it allows us to lessen the effect so it's not as obvious. So in this example, not that I probably would, but just for the purpose of demonstration, we'll say that we want to have this gondola disappear, have it look like it's not there. And I'm currently on the background layer, and again, I could take a tool like the spot healing brush, make the brush a little bigger, and just paint right over this, like this, and let go and see, yeah, it did a pretty decent job, but it's definitely gone. And if I save this, that would be permanent. So I'm going to undo that and say, just to be safe, I'm going to add a new layer. I'm going to look at the options bar for the tool I'm using. Currently I have this one called the Spot Healing Brush. I'm going to have it set to Content Aware and Sample All Layers. Sample All Layers is a fancy way of saying put the results of this tool onto the blank layer. So sample it from the layer below, our background layer, but put the results onto the blank layer. That's going to give us the best of both worlds. It's going to fix the image, but also do it in a non-destructive way that we can edit. So with Sample All Layers and my blank layer, I come in here and I do the same thing with the Spot Healing Brush, make sure I get enough that I'm getting any kind of shadow of the boat, and that looks pretty okay. It could still use a bit of help, so let's go over these areas just a little more to try and blend it in a bit perhaps. There we go. Now, if we hide the background layer, you'll see that this is the patch that was created, if you want to call it that. So technically, we're not removing it as much as we are covering it up to make it look like it wasn't there. But again, the benefit of doing this, as long as I save this PSD file, is that later on I'm thinking, actually, I kind of do want that gondola there, so I can either hide this layer or delete it completely and put the image back the way it was. If we go back and add a blank layer, another option would be to say, maybe I don't want to remove this element, I want another one. And that's what the clone stamp tool allows us to do, is to take certain pixels and copy them. So I'm going to go to my options bar, make sure it's get 100% opacity, sample all layers, and I'm going to make the brush a little bit bigger because otherwise it would take a while. And I've got a soft edge brush to make sure it blends in with the surroundings. The way the clone stamp tool works is whatever you want to clone, you hold down Option or Alt and click once. That's setting your reference point. Now I can move somewhere else and say, over here, I want another one of these, and as I start to paint, you'll see how it's making, it's almost like you're copying and pasting, but by painting. Now, as you can see, the challenge with this is, don't see how the water around doesn't quite match because the colors were a little off? Well, that's one of the things with the clone stamp tool. It's literally copying and pasting pixels as you paint. Now I could try, I suppose, taking my move tool and moving it over here to see if it blends in better. It still looks pretty obvious though, doesn't it? So let's get rid of that layer. The clone stamp tool used to be a tool we used all the time because it was one of the key tools, but frankly I find myself using the spot healing or the healing brush even more because those tools don't just copy and paste the pixels, they do that but then kind of try to blend it into the surroundings. So even you might feel like you're in completely the wrong range of colors, it will help us blend things in automatically. The other option, which is a very useful one, is the patch tool. So I'm going to add a new layer and go to the same set of tools called the patch tool. I still have content aware on, I still have sample all layers, but what this allows me to do is say if I want to cover up the gondola, I make a selection around that. Now as I move it, it's going to show me. So for example, this would not make sense to use as a patch because it's the wrong part of the photograph. But as I start to drag around, sometimes I can find a place where it's going to look pretty good. But the good news is, even if it's not quite exact, when you let go, it then attempts to blend it in. Now before you do anything else, you can play with these settings here for structure and color, and sometimes by doing a combination of those, like the structure higher and the color lower, maybe somewhere in the middle, that looks to me like it's blended in pretty well compared to what it looked like before. So, used to be, people would always say, oh, make sure you learn the clone stamp tool. Yes, to a degree, not as important as it used to be. Also, the healing brush, very useful. It's very good for things like blemishes because you can just go around very quickly and do that. But I personally like the patch tool probably the best now for a couple of reasons. One of them is you're getting a preview as you're dragging around. But secondly, when you let go, if it doesn't quite look the way you want, you still have some options in the options bar to try and help it look a little better. So very useful tool for retouching. But remember, in each case, I'm doing that on a separate layer. Very important. Now this example came in as a camera raw file, and it's that smart object thing. Here's one of the things that we'll learn more about in another lesson very soon about smart objects. Is one of the few downsides to them is that if you attempt to work directly on it, it will tell you you can't do that. It must be rasterized before proceeding. Now rasterize is a fancy word for take away the advantage of being smart and make it back into pixels, which you might think you have to do, but you actually don't. You can hit cancel, and instead, if we add a blank layer on top, now we have the same ability. So let's zoom in a little closer. And you can see she has a couple little blemishes here. This is where I'd go back to the spot healing brush, make sure it says content aware, sample all layers, and then just paint over these little blemishes and just touch them up as we go. Now the advantage of the spot healing brush is you only have to do single clicks. You don't have to do any kind of extra work. With the clone stamp tool, we'd have to be option or all clicking every time. Here, I'm just clicking everywhere where I think I can see a little blemish. So even in a case like this where I'm doing some retouching, I'm still going to save this as a PSD file just in case later on I want to go back and change my mind. Now in this example, there's one other advantage to using layers when we're retouching. See how he has some wrinkles around his eyes. Now I could add a new layer, take my spot healing brush and remove those completely, and in any dark areas under his eyes. But the problem is that's not what he looks like in real life. People know he has smile lines, and if I take them away completely, especially the older someone gets, it looks a little unrealistic. So one of the other advantages of doing something on a separate layer is that we can make the effect take it away, but not completely. In other words, I've painted on here. If I hide that, you can see there's before with the smile lines, etc. Here's without. It's still a little obvious, so I just lower the opacity a little bit. So now it's there, but it's less noticeable. So that's the other advantage of retouching onto a separate layer, is you can then lower it down. Now this is not, of course, a class on retouching. I'm just trying to give you concepts to get the ball rolling. There's lots of other options we can do with retouching, but when I'm retouching a photograph, I'm going to try at least as much as I can to still use these non-destructive methods just in case, but also because I find I can do things a little more quickly and accurately just in case I need to correct something and move something or adjust it. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of doing some of the retouching part of Photoshop, still making sure we're using layers. In this lesson, we're going to talk about making adjustments to a photograph, and we're going to, as should be no surprise to you by now, that I'm going to suggest we do it in a non-destructive way for all the advantages that gives us, not the least of which is accuracy and speed and the ability to tweak it and change our mind later on. Now, I tend to shoot my own photos in Camera Raw, so generally when I do a photo shoot, the first thing I do is do a global adjustment using Camera Raw. So if I decide I want to change the exposure or the white balance or something of that nature, I'm going to do that, as much of that as I can in Camera Raw, and then if I need to, make other adjustments with adjustment layers in Photoshop. And part of the reason is, when we talked earlier about layer masks, here's where layer masks also come into play, is they allow us to make selective adjustments very easily. So here's the image I want to work on. First of all, when I open Camera Raw, let me put it back to the Camera Raw default. So this is the way the image was shot. So here's where I'd make my overall adjustments. I think I want to pull the exposure down just a little bit to get a bit more of the sky here. And let's take the saturation up a little bit, something like that. Maybe lighten the shadows just a hair and the blacks just a bit. And I'm going to open object. Now, as we talked about before, that's going to open it into Photoshop as this smart object, which means if I need to, I can go back and make a change. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that I still would like the sky to be a little more vibrant. So in order to do that, I need to make an adjustment, but just to one area. Part of the reason that I suggest not using these commands right here is, by nature, they're going to affect the whole photograph and do it directly, so you won't have a chance to edit it, and plus it's much harder to make a selection to just one area. So instead, I'm going to use the adjustments found here, and let's add a vibrance adjustment layer, which has two options, vibrance and saturation. Now at first, when I do this, I'm going to push the saturation up really high, and you can see everything is getting oversaturated, including the boat, and that's okay initially. But take a look at what's happened. Here's my adjustment layer, and it has that familiar symbol we know now is the layer mask. So because the layer mask is white, it means the entire image is being adjusted equally. What I want to do is tell it only affect the certain areas, in this case the sky. So if I take my paintbrush, and we're going to change my color to black, I'm going to make my brush bigger. Now I'm showing you a way that initially is kind of the long way, but just so you can see, now as I paint with black, you'll see anywhere where I paint, I'm removing the saturation out of this area. So I don't want the sand to be as saturated. I just have to make sure I get it all covered, like that. And now if I look at the boat and say, well, it's also a little too saturated, I paint on that with black as well. I'm doing this really quickly just to show you the idea, but oops, I missed a whole bit in the middle there somewhere. So if we hide the layer mask temporarily by shift clicking, you can see now the entire image is being affected. If I shift click again, the black parts make the sky more saturated, but not the rest. Let's hide this whole thing. Look at the sky. See how the sky is more saturated there than it was before? So that's an example of doing selective adjustment. Now, painting a whole bunch of stuff like that, frankly, is kind of the long way, so let me show you another way that I could do it. I'm going to delete this whole thing. One of the things that is available to us in Photoshop is a series of selection tools where we can identify pixels by making a selection. So if I take a tool like the Quick Selection tool, it's going to look for edges. So as I start to drag, you'll see it made a pretty good selection of the sky and not the boat. Now there's a couple of areas I need to fix, but we'll do that in a moment. But overall, it's pretty good. The way that adjustment layers work is if you have an area selected, meaning these are the only pixels that are now active, and now I add an adjustment layer like vibrance and push the saturation, you'll see the difference is it's only saturating that part, not the rest of it. And look at the layer mask, it automatically has created that nice mask for me. It's still editable, so if I get a little closer here, let's take our zoom tool and zoom in on this area right here and say, well, some of that rope is a little too saturated. I take my paintbrush, smaller brush, and then make sure black is my foreground color, because I don't want these areas to be quite so saturated because they're kind of jumping out at me. So I'm painting with black on these areas to add them into the mask to say don't affect these areas. Down here you can see this part of the sky didn't get added in, and it should, so I'll zoom in a little closer still. Take my paintbrush and make sure it's filled with white, and wherever I start painting now I can start adding that in, and I could do a little better job of getting closer, but you get the idea here. So remember, I did the overall adjustment in Camera Raw, but now I'm doing selective adjustments in Photoshop. Let's take another example. Go back and click on the background layer, take my quick selection tool, and let's see if I can't select the blue parts of the boat. It's got a little more than I want. Anytime that happens, you hold down the Option or Alt key to remove from the selection. So now as I, in effect, paint, I'm telling Photoshop, don't include these parts, and eventually I should be able to get pretty close to just the blue. And again, we don't have to worry if it's not exacting, because the result of this operation is it's going to create a mask out of this selection, so I can still tweak it. So now let's go to something like hue saturation, see what happens if we change the hue of the boat to a different color. Now you'll see it's affecting just that area with the mask. I'd still have to, once again, tweak it. So let's zoom in a little closer. I'm using Command and Control plus. Go back to my regular paintbrush. Seems like it's around the right size. And I want to paint with black on that rope to say I don't want to change the hue of the rope, just the boat itself. I'm doing this really quickly, so you get the idea. But this is kind of the approach you would take. One of the other advantages of using an adjustment layer, by the way, is you might want to end up with just a slight change in color, but by overdoing it, like here, probably that's not the color of the boat that I want, but I'm going to overdo it so I can see what I'm doing. Now it's easier to paint the mask, and because adjustment layers can be adjusted, I can go back in and tweak it. So let's do that. Let's say, for sake of argument, I'm going to take our boat here and I'm going to make it overly saturated just so I can check and see, are there any parts that I need to adjust? So if I go in close, I can see, well, there's a few areas in here that maybe need to be tweaked a little bit. Overall, it's looking pretty good. So once I've done that, now I can say, well, I don't really need it that much, so let's take the saturation and make the hue just a sort of a more subtle shift of color. So now that I'm finished for now, what should I be doing? Well, I'm going to suggest, as always, that I'm going to save this as a PSD file, and if I need to, save a copy in JPEG that I can post on my Facebook page or whatever I want with it, but I'm going to keep this just in case, especially if you're printing, because one of the things people find when they print is the colors don't match completely. So this way I have a master file that I can come back to and say, I still feel like I need to do a little work in this area to tweak the colors. So when we're talking about adjusting, I'm going to suggest that for the most part, you avoid those commands under the Image Adjust menu. So these ones here, Image, now they're grayed out because I am working on a adjustment layer already. So all of these ones here, I would avoid these because, for two reasons. First of all, it's harder to do it selectively, but more importantly, it's a one-shot deal. You can't come back easily, as I talked about right at the beginning. This is one of these end up with deals where I want to make sure I end up with an image looking the way that I want, but I will still want to have the full control to go in and edit everything the way I want. So I want to have a mask, I want to have an adjustment layer I can edit, and the original background photo untouched completely. So if I need to, I can still edit it as well. So when you're making adjustments, that's the approach that I would take. In this lesson, we're going to talk a little bit about smart objects, but more specifically, smart filters. In Photoshop, there's a whole menu of things called filters, which are effects we can apply to a photograph, but in keeping with our non-destructive way of working, if we make them what's called a smart filter, that means we have more ability to go back and change our mind and redo things, and also, as we talked about before, figure out how you did things when you did things several months ago. So the concept of a smart object just really means we're taking a normal Photoshop layer and kind of packaging it inside a container so it protects that original information and allows us to make changes to it that can all be edited. In the case of filters, it means that those filters are also editable. So here's what it looks like. So first of all, let's talk about how a normal filter works if we don't make it smart, which again, I'm not suggesting you do, but just for purpose of comparison, here's my background layer. If I go directly here and choose some filter, like let's do a blur, this makes the photograph blurry, and you might be asking yourself, why would you want to do that? Well, maybe you want to blur parts of the image but not the rest. The problem is here, when I click OK, that's it. That's our new photograph. You can see it's just blurry and there's no place to edit it. All I can really do is undo it, but if I save and close this, that's my new document. So I'm going to undo that and instead go to the filter menu and right away choose Convert for Smart Filters. Now all that does is it packages this layer. Now it has this little symbol on it, which means it's this thing called a smart object. Really what that means for our purposes here, though, is when I do a filter like Gaussian blur, and I'm going to overdo it and click OK, compared to that first example where there was nothing to work with, here you can see now it says Smart Filters Gaussian Blur. Anytime you see an eye icon in Photoshop, that means it's a visibility thing, so I can turn it on or off to decide, do I want the filter on or not, just by simply clicking that. But more importantly, perhaps if I save this document as a PSD file, you know it's going to say that, right? When I come back the next time, Gaussian blur will show up right here. If I want to remind myself, what did I do? I double click on it and it tells me you blurred at 4D. Maybe that was a little much. I want to blur it less. Well, for now, let's put it somewhere around 10, just for the sake of argument. The other part of this is a mask. Just like we had a layer mask, this is a mask for the filter. So this is kind of interesting. Let's zoom into 100% view. And with this mask selected, I have my paintbrush. I've got my foreground color is black. Wherever I start to paint, I'll be hiding the effects of the filter. Now, I'm not in any way suggesting this would be an effect that we would do, but just to show you what's happening, see how it's allowing the filter to be only visible in some areas and hidden in others. And now that I've done that, I might decide, well, maybe I want the rest of it not quite so blurry. So now I'm having the ability to edit both the filter settings as well as the mask settings. Now again, not to suggest that you would necessarily do that on a photo like this, but that's the purpose of making a smart filter, is the fact that it's editable. However, there's a small price to pay, and it's not a big one, and we've already talked about retouching, is when I go to do something directly on this smart object, I get this what looks like the no, you're not allowed to, the no smoking symbol kind of thing where you can't do it, and if I try to do something, it says the smart object must be rasterized before proceeding. Well, the problem with rasterizing, it's a very permanent thing. It takes away the smartness and the fact that I can edit the filter, and means it just goes back to being pixels again. So I don't want to lose that ability, so I would hit cancel. So that means anything I want to do, I'm going to add a blank layer. Just like we talked about using the patch tool and the healing brush and the clone stamp tool, whatever tool we're using, making sure it says sample all layers, it's the same thing here. So this way I'm preserving the ability to edit the smart filter, and I can still continue to work on the document. So that's one of the things you'll notice. As soon as a layer is turned into this thing called a smart object, we can't work directly on it anymore, but it does open some interesting possibilities. So I'm going to close this document and make a new one. And we'll just make it a little smaller. 800 by 600 is fine. Take my type tool, and I'm just going to add some type, make it a little bigger, and hit the check mark. Now this has created a type layer, but here's one of the problems. Maybe the reason I'm doing this is I want to actually add some texture or motion to this type. Well, if I try to go and do any filter, like, for example, there's one in the filter gallery that's going to allow me to apply texture, but I'm getting this same message is saying, do you want to rasterize or convert to a smart object? I don't want to click rasterize, but if I convert to a smart object, it means the filter is smart, but it also gives me one other option. So I'm going to find this texture filter that I want called texturizer. I'm going to probably overdo it a bit so you can see that there is a texture in there, and click OK. So now you can see I have this look, but ideally I still want to be able to edit the type, and right now it looks like the layer is just a regular layer because I no longer see that letter T, but this little symbol in the corner means it's smart. Anytime you want to look at the contents of the smart object, if you double click, it opens a separate window with the original information. So now, for For example, I could say I only want it to be singular texture. I commit that. As soon as I save it, and I can now close this, you'll see this one updates. Now I realize that's a fairly weird concept to talk about at first, but think of it this way. So I have a layer, I put it inside this protective container. Now I can apply filters to this container, but inside of it is still the original content. So that's really what we're doing, is when we're looking at this way, applying the filter with the texture, we're applying it to the container, if you will. And this is only a term that I use. You don't see the term container anywhere in Photoshop. But now anytime I want to look at the contents, double click to look inside the container. It opens that separate window. So this is where I could change the color of my type to something different, whatever it might be. I could also change something about the font I want. Each time though, I'll have to commit it, hit save, and now back in my original document it updates. So this is just really to touch the surface of the concept of smart objects. At the very least, I suggest that you use smart filters for the reasons that we've seen here, that it's very editable and you can go back and change it. It also has that same concept talked about with an adjustment layer. There are many times where I want to end up with a very subtle look, but here's what I'll do. I'll originally apply the filter very dramatically, like a blur, for example, over blur it, so I can paint on that filter mask, see what I'm doing, and then put the settings back a little more towards normal. So that's a very interesting way of saving some time. Now, again, smart objects can be a whole course by itself. This was just an intention to introduce you the concept of smart filters, and in this case, more importantly, smart filters as a way of being able to try things, knowing you can experiment and easily change your mind. So this brings us to the end of our lessons for this beginner's course. And as you remember, right at the very beginning, I mentioned I wasn't going to show every tool and function because, frankly, you don't need to learn every single tool. What you need to understand are these basic principles of how you pick a tool and then go to the options bar as part of that checklist concept. And also this very important function that I've talked about many times throughout this course of working non-destructively, because frankly, that's going to set you up for success. One of the biggest things that I find when I talk to people who are starting out in Photoshop is that whole idea of, I don't know where to start and I get confused and I don't know if I'm doing it correctly. Well, if you go with this non-destructive way of working, as I mentioned, you're setting up a structure of your document that gives you lots of opportunities to change your mind and experiment. So you don't have to feel like you're painting yourself into a corner and realizing, well, now what do I do because I can't change my mind. So this non-destructive way of working means a couple things. It means we can experiment, and it also means that as long as you save that PSD file with this structure built in, you can always go back in later and remind yourself how you did it and reuse some of your work. So the key things I would suggest that you want to think about as you move forward in Photoshop are your checklist. As soon as you click on a tool, look at the options bar to make sure the tool settings are set correctly. Then look at the layers panel and see, do I have the layer set up the way I want? Should I be adding a new layer? Can I use one of the existing layers? And also, any other functions you're going to do, think about how you want to use that non-destructive method, like an adjustment layer versus an adjustment, and a smart filter versus a regular filter. And I think you'll find if you start doing those things, then as you explore more, you'll discover more about other tools. You'll be more willing to experiment with other tools because you know you have lots of opportunity to change your mind. So I hope you enjoyed this beginner's class. My name's Dave Cross. Thanks again so much for joining me.